So I've been reading the book Models of God and Alternative Ultimate Realities. And the second series of articles that articulate a different model for God is the neoclassical model. After this is the open theism model. And I'm going to talk about these together because they're pretty much the same framework. Neoclassical theism is sort of this idea that tries to make sense of these things that we want to use to define God, the omniscience, the omnibenevolence, and the omnipotence of God, and make it jive with our world. We talked about some of the problems with these in the last video, but many philosophers and theologians have addressed these issues and formed a different basis for how we think about God's nature. So neoclassical theism in particular tries to maintain this core, but modifies it just a bit by suggesting that maybe it's not perfect omniscience or perfect benevolence or perfect omnipotence. Maybe it's just maximal. So maximal meaning it's the most that is possible, but it can't be perfect because that simply wouldn't make sense for the reasons that we were discussing. So maybe God is not perfectly powerful, only maximally powerful. Same for knowledge and same for goodness. I want to talk about two models in particular that are pretty prominent and very interesting. One is the idea of middle knowledge, so Molinism, and open theism. I'll talk about open theism in particular because this is what was articulated in the series of articles in the book. So open theism is the idea that God is indeed maximally omni, and in order to make sense of our perceived free will and the problem of evil in the world, what it does is it suggests that there's actually no future that exists. So God did not create the universe with a complete history, past, present, and future. God created the world as it was, and future is simply how things progress forward in time. And so God doesn't know what's going to happen in the future because God didn't create the future yet. It doesn't exist. And so this would mean not only that God didn't create a world knowing that there was suffering, it would also mean that our decisions actually make sense. Our decisions are actually valid aspects of our own agency in the world. So the implication of this would be that God actually experiences time in the same way that we do. So there's not this idea that God is sort of above and outside of it, at least to the extent that God doesn't experience moment to moment. God does experience moment to moment and engages in the world in ways that God chooses. And that's kind of a fundamental aspect of this theory, which is that God has the ability, or at least the power, to do a variety of things, but chooses to allow free will by limiting God's self to some extent. But again, also, there are certain things that God simply doesn't know. God can know everything that can be known, but God doesn't know everything that could possibly be known because those things don't yet exist. This is the difference between open theism and Molinism. So Molinism depends upon the idea of middle knowledge. And this is basically that the future does exist to the extent that it is what would happen given the world that was created. And so God knows everything or anything that could happen, and so makes decisions within the world and interacts with the world with these things in mind, sort of pushing it, moving it forward in a particular way. So the difference between an open theist and a Molinist is that a Molinist believes that there is a future that has been established and God knows it, but God is not the cause of that future. So that is the question of causality. An open theist would say God doesn't cause the future and God doesn't know the future. Whereas a determinist, so these are the three that we're working with right now. You've got the classical theist determinist versus the more neoclassical Molinist or open theist. The determinist says that God created everything that ever is, was, or will be. God ordained it and established it, and God knows it. So, in this sense, the future is established. God created that future, God knows that future, and caused that future. Whereas the Molinist would say, God knows any possible future and works in the world towards the future that is desirable, but God does not cause that future. It is simply a result of the way the world operates. And an open theist would say the future would be causal if God knew about it, if God created the world with any such future. However, there is no such future. That future does not exist yet, and so God cannot know it. So, these neoclassical models, basically, they stem from the same desire to maintain these foundational aspects of God's nature. The difference is that they sort of dial it down a couple of notches and suggest that it can't be perfect. It can't be perfect goodness or perfect omnipotence or perfect omnibenevolence. It can only be maximal. Now, part of the criticism of these models is that this sort of minimizes the type of God that we would think or hope to be worthy of worship. It seems to suggest that there is a God who can't on some level, and maybe that's not worthy of worship. Obviously, open theists would reject this or at least disagree with it. They would say that because God still is a maximal being, and because God still does love us and works in our lives in such a way as to benefit us, and for at least a Christian, the ultimate reality of redemption is still in existence and relevant, then that would be enough to say that God is worthy of worship. Personally, I think these models definitely make more sense of what we see in the world, especially open theism. I think Molinism ultimately has the same problem that classical theism does, in that if God knew what was going to happen, if God knew that this suffering would occur, and maybe it would have been better not to create a world at all. However, it does make sense to me to suggest that the future simply doesn't exist. This idea of time is just a way of measuring our experience from moment to moment and the change that occurs. However, the future isn't involved in that. Now, I could understand the criticism that maybe this is just sort of wishful thinking, right? We're trying to dial the notches on the type of God that we want to make sense. I think this is the difficulty. But there are other models. This one is decent. I think it's sort of secondary to the question of whether or not God exists at all. But it is a helpful framework for thinking about it for anybody who is wondering about the nature of God and does believe that God exists. I think open theism seems to make more sense than classical theism. I think that it makes more sense of how God experiences time because of God's interaction with the world. And we don't need to tie our brains in knots trying to get a sense of what this God does in terms of time. God experiences time in the same way that we do, because it's simply change, right? It's not necessarily seconds, minutes, or days. But of course, it preserves free will, and it provides a more sufficient response to the problem of evil and suffering. I think another criticism, though, when it comes to the problem of suffering, is that God is taking a risk. And so this sort of makes God seem maybe cavalier, maybe even capricious. And so I think that's a picture of God that a lot of people don't like. People want to know that God is in control. People want to know that God knows and provides and protects, and they're more comfortable with the idea of the perfect omni-God. I think there are many of us who are less comfortable with that version because, a God who is in perfect control and supposedly protects and preserves, that's not really what's happening. At least not in the world that we experience. And at least not in the sense that is most real to us here and now. So I think that these models are compelling, especially if you do believe in God and you're very comfortable with the idea that God exists. I think that this is a viable model for God's nature. However, there are still those issues, and that's why other models have emerged. And so we'll talk about those models next. So stay tuned for process theism.